Today, let's have a glimpse of how philosophy is integrated in language, viewing on Quine and Carnap's contrasting perspectives on intentionality.
Good morning, everyone. Modern semantics and pragmatics emerged from the work of philosophers and philosophically inclined mathematicians. Rodolphe Carnap and Willard Quine were among the leading philosophers of the 20th century and known for their issues on intentionality. Both were logicians as well as philosophers, but their interests in logic were quite different. They both began with a syntactic approach to logic and language. Rudolf Carnap was influential in German and Austria philosophy after the First World War, but moved to the US before the Second World War. He also taught at Chicago and at UCLA. Carnap sought to extend logical techniques that had been used to formalize mathematics to the other domains, especially to the physical sciences. He also embraced Tarski's model-theoretic approach to semantics and sought to use it in his philosophical projects and to apply these techniques to what he called intentional constructions. Another is Willard V.O. Quine. He traveled widely and taught at Harvard for his entire career and contributed idiosyncratic logic and its systematic use in formalizing set theory and mathematics. Quine avoided Tarski's ideas on semantic techniques in his logical work and rejected attempts to extend them to modal and psychological languages. He regarded intentionality as problematic and viewed semantic theories of intentionality with deep suspicion. As we will see, the debate between Quine and Carnap over intentionality is in fact only an aspect of a deeper difference of opinion concerning the nature of semantics.
The phenomenon of intentionality and its opposite, extensionality, have to do with the substitution of equals for equals. Carnap characterizes these notions in the following series of definitions. Sentence 1 is equivalent to sentence 2 if and only if 1 and 2 are either both true or both false. Or generally, expression A is equivalent to expression A prime if and only if A and A prime have the same semantic value. In particular, if A and A prime are referring expressions, they are equivalent if they refer to the same thing. A syntactic constituent A in an environment 1 is interchangeable with a phrase A prime of the same syntactic type if and only if 1 is equivalent to 1 prime, where 1 prime is the result of replacing the constituent A in 1 with A prime. The sentence 1 is exceptional with respect to a certain occurrence of the expression A in 1 if and only if the occurrence is interchangeable with any expression equivalent to A. Finally, the sentence 1 is intentional with respect to an occurrence of the expression A in 1 if and only if 1 is not extensional with respect to this occurrence. From the definition, we can see that intentionality is a semantic notion. It has to do with truth and reference. It refers to a specific position in a sentence at which some component phrase occurs. We introduce some commonly used terminology. The component phrase occurs in the context of a sentence. In this context, it may or it may not be intentional. Narrowing linguistic notation for phrase structures, the structure of a noun phrase, an NP, occurring somewhere in an arbitrary sentence is this. You can see the diagram. In this diagram, X, Y, Z represents stretches of syntactic material, and X, Z's is the context where the noun phrase Y appears. Where Y prime is another noun phrase, the diagram 0.1, 0.2 will be the result of replacing Y with Y prime in this context. It is this replacement we need to consider in testing intentionality. Substituting equals for equals is a pretty fundamental principle of reasoning. Examples: Jane is shorter than the the tallest person in the room. Molly is the tallest person in the room. So Jane is shorter than Molly. But intentionality is not at all unusual. As the following two examples show, we have here, Jane might have been shorter than the tallest girl in the room. Jane, in fact, is the tallest girl in the room. So Jane might have been shorter than Jane. Second example below. Fred suspects that Jane is the tallest girl in the room. Molly is the tallest girl in the room. So Fred suspects that Jane is Molly. These examples illustrate the typical sorts of contexts that can precipitate intentionality. Right is a modal verb, and suspect is a psychological one. Now, there are two responses to the problem of intentionality. Carnap's response: first, treat it as a challenge, as something that needs to be overcome by developing an improved semantic theory. Quines' response: take it to indicate that the project of developing a semantics for any language capable of talking about modal or psychological matters is fundamentally misguided in some way.
For the continuation, from 1947 to the late 1970s, Quine produced a number of objections to the very idea of intentional semantics. The first objection is the modal logic, which means the logic of terms like must, may, and should. It goes beyond merely true or false by embedding what we say or think in a larger conceptual space referring of what might be or might have been, should be or should have been, or can still come to be. The second objection is the ontological, which is the concern itself with what exists and can range from asking what does it mean for a thing to exist, to asking what exists, and to identify and establish relationship between existent things. The third objection is the methodological considerations. It is a philosophical position which underpins our understanding of what we are doing when we generate knowledge about the world. To appreciate the background of Quine's earliest concern, it is important to understand. The first one, use-mention distinction. It is a foundational concept of analytic philosophy according to which it is necessary to make a distinction between using a word or phrase and mentioning it. The second, the separation of object language from meta-language. When we say object language, it is an ordinary language used to talk about things or objects in the world. When we say meta-language, it is an artificial language to analyze or describe the sentences or elements of object language itself. The third one is the formulation of logical syntax. It determines how the symbols of the language can be combined to form sentences. In the 20th century, formal logic evolved into the study of mathematical language and mathematical reasoning. Since logic is a branch of mathematics, logic itself must be among the subjects that logic can study. This reflective twist turned out to be crucial for some of the most important results in the field. A logician dealing with a system of this sort is of course using language to talk about language. To introduce a technical term, the logician is using a meta-language to theorize about an object language. The meta-language will use expressions to name the formulas of the object language. But often these expressions will look a lot like the expression they supposed to name. It is easy to get confused about this sort of thing. To write 2 plus 2 is equal 4. For instance, when what is meant is the formula 2 plus 2 equals 4 is provable. But the former is using the formula to assert that the sum of 2 with itself is 4. The letter is mentioning the formula, saying that there is a proof of it in some axiomatic system. As we said, it is easy to confuse use and mention. Such confusions are invited by the fact that if quotation belongs to spoken language at all, it is almost always covert. In written language, quotation marks serve many purposes, only one of which is to name the expression between the quotation marks. We ourselves will use single quotes for use mention, with a few exceptions. We will omit quotes in displayed examples, and because quotes within quotes can be hard to parse, when we quote a sentence that itself involves quotation, we will use corner quotes for the outermost quotation. Thus, the sentence "Snow is white" is true.
In the 1930s, many logicians came to believe that the work of earlier thinkers had been flawed by carelessness about use and mention. Some philosophers even believed that use-mention confusions were a pervasive source of error in philosophical thinking. And Quines and other prominent contemporary logicians were somewhat obsessive about the use-mention distinction and the employment of various devices, and especially of quotation, to distinguish the two explicitly. Some of Quines' earliest criticisms of modal logic seem to arise from the thought that it involves confusions of use and mention. If, for instance, the proper analysis of a modal claim like 0.1.15 is 0.1.16, that is, if 0.1.16 is the correct explication of 0.1.15, then modal statements contain covert quotations. In the table, the modal claim 0.1.15 corresponds to the modal statement 2 plus 2 is necessarily equal to 4. The modal claim 0.1.16 corresponds to the modal statement the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4 is provable from the axioms of arithmetic. If so, then a logician who ignores the hidden quotation marks may be guilty of confusion. This suspicion is compounded by the fact that early work in modal logic, such as Lewis, is indeed confused in just this way. Quines correctly recognized that quotation creates environments that are logically peculiar and needs special treatment. Certainly, covert quotation can produce intentional context.
Quines is careful to avoid saying that modal and other intentional constructions involve implicit quotation. Take note that earlier in the first edition of Carnap 1956, Carnap had proposed a quotational analysis of belief sentences according to which belief is in the relation between a person and the sentence. Alonzo Church criticized such analysis in Church 1950, and Carnap accepted this criticism and modified his account. Quines, on the other hand, was aware of this exchange and cited Church's paper in Quines 1980. Nevertheless, he believes that the analogy between quotation and intentionality is suggestive, and in particular, that quantifying in to an intentional context binding a variable in an intentional context with a quantifier is semantically problematic. Quantifying into intentional context, or quantifying in for short, occurs when a quantifier binds an open variable that lies within the scope of sentences. Systems of quantified modal logic, or the QML, routinely include formulas of this kind, but Willard van Orman Quines, 1963, famously argues that quantifying in is incoherent. Quines asks what an example like 0.122 can mean. It seems to be saying that there is some number that necessarily is greater than 7. You might think that 0.122 is true, because 9, for instance, is a number, and because as a matter of mathematical necessity, 9 is necessarily greater than 7. But Quines, writing before the demotion of Pluto, asks what this number is. It can't be 9 because 9 is the number of the planets, and the number of the planets is not necessarily greater than 7. Linguists may suspect that there is a scope ambiguity in Quines' example. The adverb necessarily may take wide or narrow scope with respect to negation. Quine frames his argument without seeming to notice the ambiguity. In this connection, see Stolnacher and Tomlinson, 1968. Quine's point seems to be that quantification is quantification over objects, and that an object is what it is and has the properties it does independently of how it is named. As a way of emphasizing this point, Quine uses the term referential opacity instead of Carnap's intentional. Referential opacity is the failure of substitutivity of identity, SI for short, and in Quine's view of existential generalization, or the EG for short as well. Quine thinks that its solution in epistemic and doxastic contexts, which relies on the notion of exportation, leads to undesirable results. It is possible to invent a formal system and yet to be confused about its semantics. Sometimes, perhaps, the confusion can be so acute that there is no sensible way to provide an interpretation of the formalism. In his early criticisms of intentionality, Quine seems to be saying that logical systems that combine modalities or other intentional operators with quantification and that allow formulas like this, where this one contains occurrence of X in intentional context, suffer from this sort of confusion. Natural languages also allow this sort of quantifying in. For instance, consider the following from a Manitoba Department of Corrections webpage. Anyone believed to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs will not be permitted to visit. If these criticisms are right, it would follow that taking language of this kind seriously and attempting to provide a semantic account of it is misguided. Doubts about quantifying in can lead to skepticism about the viability of natural language semantics.
Over the years, Quine changed the focus of its criticisms, no longer insinuating that quantifying in leads to semantic incoherence, but claiming only that it leads to theories that are philosophically unacceptable. One line of argument based on semantic indeterminacy, the underdetermination of semantic theories by linguistic evidence. Another is ontological. Throughout his career, Quine has a preference for ontological parsimony, the idea that theories that postulate fewer kinds of things are preferable. This preference seems to have been motivated by a liking for a philosophical nominalism. Philosophical nominalism is the position that denies the existence of universals and more generally of abstract entities, or that at least treats these things with suspicion and seeks to minimize them. Universals are what nominalized predicates purport to denote. Goodness, beauty, and triangularity are universals. The category of abstract entities is somewhat vague, but includes sets, numbers, species, mathematical points, and other non-concrete things that don't seem to be located in space or time. Quine recognized correctly that a semantic theory of natural language would have to reify or treat as existing a host of things that philosophers with nominalist inclinations would find unacceptable. Anyone would find this question sensible, even if it might be difficult to answer exactly. How many inhabitants of Ohio are there? But Quine thinks that if theory were to admit possible objects, and this it seems is what a semantic theory of model logic with quantifiers would have to do, it would have to treat questions like how many possible inhabitants of Ohio are there as legitimate. In fact, it is far from obvious that accepting the legitimacy of quantifying into model context entails accepting the existence of merely possible entities. There are at least 3 people who might be inhabitants of Ohio, quantifies over flesh and blood actual people, saying that at least 3 of them might live in Ohio. Contrast this with Ohio might have at least 3 inhabitants, which does not quantify over actual people. But Quine is correct in claiming that it is exceedingly hard to design a model semantics that skews ontological commitment to non-actual objects.
Rodolphe Carnap and Alonzo Church opposed Quines' criticisms of semantics. They assert that semantics is a science.
It is entitled to make whatever assumptions are appropriate for its own needs, and that philosophical criticisms of these assumptions are beside the point. Quine was a lifelong advocate of naturalism. Naturalism is a philosophy that views all objects and events are capable of being accounted for by scientific explanation. Truth can be discovered only through nature. Quine believes that scientific inquiry provides firmer ground than philosophical considerations, and it is peculiar to find him rejecting semantics for philosophical reasons. Quine considers semantics more like a philosophical than a scientific enterprise. As long as semantics is part of philosophy, Quine is simply indulging in the usual philosophical business of criticizing philosophical positions. In fact, during much of the 20th century, semantics was primarily a philosophical pursuit, but now it has become part of linguistics. With some justice, linguists are likely to feel indignant at philosophers who wish to tell which parts of their subject are legitimate. Quine himself doesn't have much help to offer here. He seems to have little to say about what qualifies an area of inquiry as a science. But he might respond that it is up to linguists if they wish to do semantics, to put it on a sound enough footing so that they will not find themselves committed to philosophical claims that philosophers can legitimately criticize. On both sides in this debate, we can find points that are worth taking seriously. Certainly, Carnap and Church were right that a dedicated scientific approach to semantics based on ideas from logic would be rewarding. Quine was right that such theorizing would make problematic assumptions, but in this respect, semantics doesn't seem to be unusual. The foundations for a productive conversation between philosophers and scientists, in which, on the one hand, the philosophers respect the work of the scientists, and on the other hand, the scientists can accept philosophical questions about foundations as legitimate and even interesting.
I hope your knowledge of these philosophies has been enriched and this knowledge has deepened your understanding of the language. Thank you for watching.